Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the BIM Tube podcast. My name is Stephen, and today I've got David McKeown with me. So welcome, David. Thank you for joining me.
Hello. Thank you very much indeed, Steve.
Great. Thank you. And as always, we are delighted to have our guest here because we're going to talk about data, digital, better information management. That's what the BIM is about. But that's not going to be the focus. The focus is going to be the theme and tone and topics that we get onto. And today, obviously, it's with David as our guest. It's no doubt going to be around strategic asset management and infrastructure, but we'll see where we go. But David, as with all our guests, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself for people that don't know who you are, and also if you would give us just a brief history of your career, your background, and how did you get to where you are today. So over to you, David.
Yeah, sure. Okay. By training, I'm an electrical engineer, electronics mainly, control systems, and I ended up, my first job was in railways, looking after safety engineering and communications, control and signaling as it's usually called these days. And I suppose the most interesting thing that I got involved with was the first use of computers for safety engineering, which is quite an interesting challenge. When the railway got privatized, and roughly about the same time, I went freelance. I was interested in infrastructure as a whole by then, not just electrical. And I got involved with starting a thing called the Institute of Asset Management, where I had realized that I enjoyed being an engineer. I think I was trying to do it well, but I was spending money that I don't think is justified. And I couldn't relate in the business the money and the things that I did with what the customer needed. So I got really interested in how do you actually look after value and things over their lifetimes. So my background now is, I suppose I'm out of the Institute of Asset Management. I'm a volunteer like other people, and I'm passionate about trying to find often public sector and infrastructure things that can be improved.
Great. Thank you, David. I mean, maybe I should sort of talk about the fundamentals just before. I'm sure we will get on to, we will get onto the metrics and how we measure benefit and all these kind of things, but just the absolute fundamentals, which I enjoy you speaking about, is maybe what is asset management? What do you mean by asset management? And the difference between that and managing assets. Now, I know you've said this 100 times, but for a new audience, please, just one more time, David.
Yes. Well, no, it needs saying, and it needs all of us being reminded by everyone else too. So the thing that I really got interested in as a maintenance engineer was that I realized that maintenance can't make something do something it wasn't meant to do. So there is a limit in terms of performance and perfection as to what you can do with maintenance. And therefore you have to think about the life cycle. So you first have an idea. Nothing gets done without an idea. And then you acquire it, you buy it, or you design it, you make it. But at some point you make it useful. So the most important part of an asset's life is when it's in use and therefore being maintained. But at some point, either it has a fault, or it comes to the end of its useful life, or your needs change. So for example, a building might no longer be needed, you might want to repurpose it. And that is important to provide for and think about. So the asset has a life cycle. And that's really what we call managing the assets, or the management of assets. Asset management, the definition actually is the coordination of activity. And this always surprises people new to it. The coordination of activity to realize value from assets. That's not exactly right, but that's the gist. So ask yourself the question, why? What's the business you're in? What are you trying to do? What are the outcomes you want? How are you going to get there? What assets do you actually need? What's their function? How long do they need to last? How much are you willing to pay? And of course, this varies enormously from a reservoir, which might be 150 years old today, to something that's electronic and gets replaced, like your computer or your phone. So you can apply this to very complex, big infrastructure. It's much easier. Your mum does asset management. Your mum used to decide, buy a new jacket or mend it. And that brings in the really interesting question of, why do you need a jacket? Is it to look sexy and to interest the other sex or other people or whatever else you want to do? Or is it to keep the rain off? Now, if it's to keep the rain off, you might mend it. But if you want to look good, you might want a different jacket or whatever. So I don't think I can make it shorter than that, but I hope that explains the difference.
Great, thank you. No, I think that comes across clearly. That analogy is, well, I might have to use that myself with the coat, but the or the jacket. I think, yeah, being the clarity of purpose and outcome of the asset or systems itself, I think that did come across, and I think that is clear. And like you said, it's the coordination. So the implication there is there's a governance structure, there are multiple actors and all the rest of it, which we'll get onto. But I mean, as far as one of the themes we were going to touch on, maybe we'll just cut to the chase and talk about value. You know, why save that? Because that's ultimately surely one of the main themes that people should be talking about. So how do we measure the value, or is the purpose of an asset or an asset system measuring the value in it, David? And if so, how do we measure value?
So let me just answer that in a moment. You've reminded me that actually I probably need to explain why the coordination of activity isn't the same as normal management. And the biggest problem that most organizations have, even if they don't realize it, is silos or chimneys or smokestacks or bubbles. In other words, groups of people who don't really talk to or collaborate with others. Now, we can come back to that, but that's why the coordination is important. And I would encourage you to look at a 8-minute video, I think it is, called The Big Picture, because it shows with animation much more clearly than my words what that's all about. Value is really interesting, Steve, and it's something that none of us all agree on. And we keep changing our views as well. And the reason is primarily, I think, that value is personal, value is subjective, value is, first of all, the question is value for whom or to whom. And value isn't the same thing to everybody. And value might change over time. So something might become more important to you as you realize what you need to do or whatever. So value is not measurable only in money. And one of the really exciting things to me about the new integrated reporting and 6 capitals is it immediately expands the mind to think the way we did 35 years ago, which is about there are things that aren't measurable in money. So value might be the environment. A lot of us are very worried about sustainability, and I don't think sustainability actually is the right word. It's not strong enough. We need regeneration. We've damaged so much. So how do you measure that? And if you're a parent, what's the value of your child? You're going to put that in money? Really? You can put the costs in money, quite expensive actually, but not the value. So value would be a podcast or 10 on its own, Steve, but I hope that gives a flavor to start us off.
Great, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. For people to think that it's not, as you've said, it's not just financial, it's not just dollars or euros or pounds or whatever. There's something beyond that. It depends, again, like you've said, I'm just paraphrasing, it depends who you ask, right? If you speak to accountants or people with want to talk about the fiscal frameworks, then it is. You did mention the 6 capitals. Now maybe we could just delve into that a little bit, just to explain what they are, and we will loop back around to sort of data and how we might measure these things. But what are the six capitals, and do you have any examples of them being used in the real world that you could share?
So it's a bit early to find really good examples of them in a stable use, but we'll come back to that and what's happening, because actually some of it's becoming mandatory, at least in Europe, next year. So the idea is that let's take something that's the most obvious bit, the environment. Let's take water, or all the resources that people mine or take into their business. Often people aren't paying somebody for the rain. So even a water company, ironically, what did it sell? It sells water. But actually, the one thing it doesn't own is the water. It might own the pipes, the reservoirs, the pumps, the billing, all the machinery. But the rain either falls or it doesn't. It's either collected or it doesn't. It's either polluted or not. So it's quite interesting, actually. We haven't got enough water now. We're extracting far too much from rivers and aquifers. We haven't thought about it. It's not a stable resource. So there's two things to consider. One is, within the business, what are the resources that you're using from the environment? And that actually ought to be accounted for, and in some cases, maybe even paid for or taxed, or at least the polluter should pay. Then you've got the idea that if you've got a planet which is finite, and you've got all these resources, which might be rare earth metals, or there might be coke or carbons or whatever, who owns them, who shares them, who pays who for them, and when you've used them up, whose fault is it, where do we go next? And there's all kinds of unanswerable questions at the moment. I'm just explaining the range of the problem. But the same thing goes for when an accountant doesn't know how to count within the company, they call it goodwill. So if you want to sell your company, it might be reputation. It might be, for example, patents or IP, intellectual property. You might not be able to touch it. It might only be a permission. It might be a grant to use a particular route to run your cables or something. So we get to the idea that there's some things which you can't directly measure in money. They might have value depending on how you sell them, buy them, whatever. And the idea is that the integrated thinking and integrated reporting makes people take their decisions in the light of consequences, not just profit or loss. And the idea is therefore that there's 6 of these. It's one arbitrary framework. It happens to be the one that the World Bank, World Economic Forum and UN and people are backing. So I suggest you use it. And you will find it by just Googling either 6 capitals or by looking for integrated reporting. So the idea is that you don't have 6 annual reports. You have an integrated report so that your activity accounts for consequences that aren't just money. So I'm in danger of rabbiting on for too long, Steve, but is that clear so far?
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you, David. No, absolutely, it is clear. It's about having that sort of multifaceted or approach, isn't it? And like you said, the integrated. I mean, what obviously anything you mention, I will link to it again. That's what I do on all these podcasts, David. So if you make any reference, don't worry, it will get linked to. But just to read them out, maybe you disagree with the way they're described here, but manufactured capital, natural capital, which is the example you gave, social and relationship capital, human capital, intellectual capital, financial capital. No, they're the ones I've got. I don't know. Yeah,
that is right, and we can run through those in some detail if you want to. I think that might get over long for this particular discussion, but I think the point is that you can think about them as capabilities. They're not all physical assets. You can think about them as interactive consequences. So I think a nice, easy way of thinking about this is that we all understand that actions have consequences. Your decisions, what you do, have consequences, good or bad. If you think about that as your company, a nice image is to drop a pebble in a pond and think about ripples that go out for quite a while. But there might also be unintended consequences. There might be damaging consequences. And people tend not to report these in their annual reports. So the poison left by the mining operation tends not to be highlighted by the PR department. So the idea is that we look at all the consequences, and those 6 categories help you understand and think about them, because some need to be judged in different ways.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's just obviously we could go into detail, and you're right, we probably don't have the scope in this podcast, but I will link to them. And I think just the concept of understanding that it is multifaceted and that it's by definition subjective, because it has to be, because it depends, like you're saying, the individual, the organization. That you've already made the point that things change over time, which might be self-evident, but people don't think like that. You know, these things need reviewing, don't they? It might be whether it's directly aligned to a changing policy or cultural preference, and you know, we could get into politics, which we don't do on this podcast, but nevertheless, people know the kind of thing. And the other thing I should just, we should maybe just step back again for the audience, that when you say asset, which you've already implied, but when you actually defined it, it doesn't have to be physical. And I know you've already talked about intellectual but property, but I just thought I'd make that clear for people, because often we do talk about infrastructure. I certainly do, and I know you probably will most of the time as well. But it's not just that as well. Could you just elaborate on that? I know we've probably moved on from that point, but could you just elaborate on sort of what we mean by an asset? Again, was sort of circling here, and then we'll move off this point. Yeah.
So an asset is anything that has value now, could be made to have value, and can have its value to you or to your customer increased or decreased. So it's anything. So that could be, and I should have got the definition in front of me, but I think it says thing, item, or entity in the standard. So what that's really trying to say is physical assets are rather obvious. You can touch them, pick them up, move them, use them. It's less obvious when it's your reputation, but that has a huge value to a company. Or think of a brand, you know, what is Coca-Cola? Its biggest single item of value is its actual logo and the shape of the bottle. So people protect those things jealously and put money into them and manage them through a life cycle, which is quite interesting. So those assets can be intellectual property, it can be money, it can be capabilities, it can be the results of what people do. So that's a capability for the company. So it's anything and everything at the end of the day that could have value to what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, or value or potential value, isn't it? And again, of course, I will link. I won't give people the standards for free. Don't worry, David. But I certainly will link to online references where people can look up. But I just wanted to put that in there at the beginning to make it clear, because obviously this is where the actual information or data or intelligence or insight or knowledge of, and it could be a physical asset, obviously therefore becomes an asset itself. I know we're probably well versed at talking about these things, but again, that's where I find sometimes people find that quite challenging, that that the information itself or data itself could have value, and then we're sort of in a parallel about, well, the physical infrastructure and the data. Have you got any examples, or do you know of any organizations where they've actually said data or information is an asset and been quite clear about it?
Yeah, so let me actually, you asked me a question about, is anyone using the 6 capitals? Let me give you an example of something which was done a long time ago. So it wasn't actually using the language of the 6 capitals, but was thinking about natural assets. So if you think about a city, council, local community, it costs them money to look after parks and playgrounds for kids and things like that. So it requires money to build those things, but it also needs maintenance. But there's no income. So you're not running a normal business where you can do it all in money terms. Very good example was Calgary in Canada, it's Alberta, isn't it? Calgary did a big exercise on their parks. They've got quite a big area, of which the city has a number of parks, and they used to do it by saying the ratio of facilities to the population. But actually, in the end, that wasn't what pleased the people. The areas where people had kids wanted playgrounds. The ones who were older or busy in different stages of their lives, maybe in a city, didn't care, didn't want them. They all wanted them cleaned up. They all wanted dog mess removing, and a lot of them wanted working clean lavatory toilets. So they did big surveys, and you can't measure a lot of this. You can do assessments of what people think. And to cut a long story short, they saved a lot of money. They reduced some facilities. They enhanced some facilities where they were appropriate, and everybody was happy. So that's an example of where you're dealing with the real world, because we're dealing with shrubs and trees and grass and plants and space and water and ponds and ducks and whatever. The costs are real. The benefits are very hard to demonstrate. And that's one of the things that would be much more easily done now with examples in 6 capitals. So to come back to assets, and I'm sorry, the question you asked again, just exactly what was it?
We will do. So thank you for elaborating on the previous. Yeah, it was about the asset and intangible assets. So I didn't use the word intangible, but intangible assets. And just, did you have any examples of where people have valued specifically data and information, just looping it back to the podcast?
Okay, so interestingly, there are any number of examples where the right records of buildings and installations and systems enable the work you're doing. And if you haven't got them, actually some of it becomes dangerous. So think about interfering in control systems on maybe aeroplanes while they're flying. That's not probably a good thing to do without understanding what things are, and that depends on records and drawings and information. To turn it back into the value piece, a recent example was in the UK that Highways England, no, sorry, they're National Highways now, realized that their job wasn't just to look after the tarmac and the roads and make them safe for people to drive on. People are really interested in where there are traffic jams or there are going to be obstacles to their journeys. Who's got that information? National Highways. So they realized that actually real-time data, as well as obviously patterns and records, would be valuable. They could sell them. They can sell data to local radio stations and to people who want to know what's going to happen to their journey. That's a very simple example and quite recent.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it becomes a byproduct. It's fairly fundamental to the operations within that organization, but to some extent it is a byproduct. I know maybe not selling it, but I know similar things at Transport for London, providing an API, some way of sharing data. But yeah, it's all about it. It's all about sort of is the information in this specific example around the information getting to the right people, and what value, what does it mean to
well, it's more than that. And the really interesting thing, this is what I get passionate about, is the clarity of purpose of the organization. So is the job of the organization to keep the roads free of potholes? Yes, of course it is. But is that its purpose? And I would say no. Its purpose actually is to enable the journeys of the people using those roads. So that's the right traffic control measures, that's the right layouts, that's the right routes, but it's also that real-time data to avoid making the traffic jams work. I mean, supposing there's been an accident, so it's nobody's fault, let's say, but you're getting traffic backing up the motorway. There is a problem there that you are not enabling if you don't tell people about it. So if you then understand the purpose of your business to enable the journey, and how do you do that? Well, one of the things is you keep the tarmac in good condition, but another is that you provide information. So it then becomes a critical part of the objective of the company. You can make money from it. You can also organize yourself to do that better. Infrastructure is a classic case where take transport. It's not about trains and roads and trams and whatever. It's actually about mobility. It's about people wanting to be at B when they're at A. It's about moving goods. It's about your overnight deliveries. So you need to understand the purpose before you can actually understand better how to organize and get the right assets and use them.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's about layering, isn't it? I'm fortunate enough to originally have some sort of GIS or mapping background, so I literally think in layers of information anyway. But often the analogy, I guess, for people that aren't from that sector is things are layered, aren't they? Like we're talking about the physical infrastructure or the asset systems, and then the example you just gave of system or services, should I say, providing a service. And maybe, I know you gave a good example there, but maybe is there another example of where what would have been known as traditional asset or infrastructure organizations are providing a service? Have you got just another example, just to explore the service delivery specifically? Is there another example?
Well, I mean, let's stick with water, as we've talked about part of it. Why do we need water? And it's, that might seem like a damn fool question, but individuals need water because they need to drink and they need to wash and they need to cook and all those things. But actually societies need water for public health, So what is the job of a government? Yes, it's to protect you. Yes, it's security. But actually, if you're living in filth and typhoid and so on, you can't actually have a flourishing community. So your water policy might need, and I think actually I'm hearing those current debates in the UK right now. Should we be charging the same rates to people who've got very little money, or should we see this as a public health issue? And that you could say the same thing about, for example, health services and so on. So some of these are mixes of people and concrete, but some of them are just literally about concrete. And if you think about a new project in pure infrastructure, we ought to think about it as adding to the existing already built infrastructure, not as a freestanding project. And too often we have another shiny project and it doesn't link nicely with all the existing stuff.
Yes, it's a good point, isn't it? It depends what perspective people have. If they're working on a project, whether it's a shiny one in the UK or elsewhere, we can think where we might be implying as well in other parts of the world. It's not, or it could be anywhere. It's not the same perspective if you're a government entity, providing a service. I know you gave an example, but maybe do you think there are differences in your mind between a government entity? Maybe it's the example you gave. A government entity and their responsibilities and private. What do a private entity building, for example, a high-rise office complex in, for example, London? Do you think their perspective is different, and how is it different? Maybe it's the example you gave, or is there anything to add about public versus private interpretation?
I think I'd say that there are traditions which differ in different countries. And without getting political, I think it's just worth recognizing that there are countries run in different ways. There are countries which are focusing on individuals and individual choice. There are countries which think much more collegiate or about societies. Let me take a different example to the UK. So if you take the Netherlands, I'm always impressed by how they think about the built environment. And let me widen it from your building that you asked about. I think you need to look at the consequences over the life of that asset. So if you're building a building, how long are you expecting it to last? And in the UK, I live in a house that's 300 years old. If you go to America, you probably live in a house that's 30 years old. And the old style used to be that you think, okay, we'll tear it down and build a new one. I think we probably have to move to a different world where we don't do that so much, and where the building you're talking about might be repurposed during its life, because we don't know what society wants. But in the Netherlands, they've got to manage a land that's below sea level already. And they think in terms of dikes as being perhaps the most important thing, naturally. But they also think about integrated needs. So there's some really good examples, and take Rotterdam, where you've got car parks, which are also the dike. So you're using the space, you're using the building to get value from it in multiple ways. And I think the short answer to your question, and I've gone around the houses a little, is the built environment as a whole should be considered before you add another building to it, or indeed take one away or change it. And from there, you should be able to establish who is that building going to affect, not just the intended occupant from whom you take money. So Rotterdam, for example, would require you to have a sump underneath the building to absorb floodwater initially. But they'd also probably use that floodwater to water the plants and trees in your street. So you get benefits from an integrated approach.
Yeah, great. Thank you, David. Talking about an integrated approach, I think that's probably historically, and you mentioned silos, and I know you mentioned that already, about careful what I say here, but traditionally there perhaps hasn't been enough integration wherever you look. What are the answers? How do we encourage? It doesn't have to be focused on the UK necessarily, but generally at a top government level, just anywhere, how do we encourage that cross-domain, cross-sector integration for infrastructure? It's difficult because we follow the money. They all have different pots.
Yeah. And so you're tempting me to get into all kinds of areas, and I'd probably better restrain myself on some of them.
Okay.
So I would love to know the real answer to that question, because for 20, 30 years, I've been trying to spread the message. I'd give an example, which is a bicycle, which is that once you've learned to ride a bicycle, you don't really forget it. And once you've learned to think about everything or anything with what I think was asset management, the first question you're asking is why, where's the value, how long are you going to keep it or do it or use it or whatever, and value to whom. So is this a commercial activity, or is this actually about society's benefit? How does it impact other people? What are the consequences you'd prefer not to look at, but actually are real, often in the environment or on people? So, for example, the gig economy, or where people have no guaranteed hours of work, or sometimes even rates of pay, depending on the country. How reasonable is that in the long term for society, and what are we doing to people? So I think about everything from this. This well, the biggest useful question for me is, what do you want the outcome to be? If you say that to a child who wants another ice cream and is going to get fat if you give them 1,000 of them, what do you want the outcome to be? Then you can begin to answer, where's the value? If it's complicated and it's systems of systems or big business or infrastructure, you probably need to think about disaggregating that into the various tasks. So, for example, to use the Highways England example we talked about, National Highways, so sorry. You've got to look after the infrastructure, but you've maybe also got to look after the information. So once you've understood, what do you want the outcomes to be? Well, I want to enable the journeys of people. What are all the things I need to do to make that happen? And then you can work back down to what are the capabilities you need. Maybe it's money, so funding is usually in the picture, but it might also be the right people, the right competencies, the right buildings, the right manufactured goods. It might be all kinds of things that you need. And some of those things might be very long-term. So building up know-how often takes time. Others might be, you go and get it tomorrow in the shop. So the integrated approach for me applies to your children. I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. Okay, well, do you want to work with animals, or do you want to work in an office, or do you want to be a billionaire, or what is it that matters to you? And you can only get to the answer to these questions in the public sphere, in the private sphere, in commerce, if you understand who's affected, who are the stakeholders, and how do you satisfy them? How do you satisfy yourself?
Yes, thanks for that, David. I just keep thinking, it's keep asking the why, isn't it? I was thinking about Socratic questioning was slightly going off topic there, but I think it is the why. You can keep asking why, can't you? The ultimate why. And again, it depends, as you've said, it depends on people's perspectives. I think that is the challenge. People are getting on with their own life and their own focus. And it reminds me also of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I don't get into these things normally, but without going into the detail for the benefit of people listening or watching, it's just people focus on their immediate, on things that affect them, right? Again, just paraphrasing it, don't they? They focus, and I think that often is part of it. I don't know if you've got anything to reflect on that. I often have it in my mind when I'm talking about literally the bigger pictures, of like, environmental things, perhaps. And I think, well, actually, I might be not focused on that if there were other immediate concerns. I don't know. Have you got anything to say about how we communicate this?
The why question is fundamental. Also long term, and long term can be very, very, very long term. If you're talking about some built structures of roads, I mean, for example, a lot of our roads follow the Roman roads from hundreds of years ago. The long term can be only the useful adage of begin with the end in mind, or think about what you want, or what do you want the outcome to be. So as an individual, supposing we had infinite resources, effectively, there's only 1 million people in the world, and you're living in the countryside, and you've got a little small holding. If you don't manage your waste, you'll still get vermin, rats, and ill health. if you want to have a hamlet or a town or a city, this becomes absolutely inescapable and essential that there's a central way of doing a lot of this. So the scale of things matters as to the solution, but the Maslow's hierarchy is quite a good way of thinking about, you need air and water and food and all shelter and those things. But how you do that will be done well or badly. We see on television these days some of these people who have to live in the outdoors for a while, and some of them make a complete mess of it, literally, and then get mice, rats, and so on, and they get sick. Others don't. So I'm not sure how far you want to develop the theme, but it depends really where we're talking about societal needs, and I think that really matters because you're affecting a lot of other people or everybody else. Think of it that way. If it's individual, it still matters.
Great, thanks, David. I mean, again, we could go deep on that one, but again, maybe we could explore that on a dedicated podcast, because I think it does sort of go off in a fractal, doesn't it? How deep we want to go. One thing that you did mention, so if we just move off that topic for a moment, was I think you did actually say knowledge management. Now, this for people that have heard or listened to any of the other podcasts, then this often comes up in my mind, where we can talk about data, or bring it back just for a minute for the data and the information management, the insights that can help enable what we're talking about. How do we measure with data? Often what I find is people aren't thinking enough about knowledge management. Now, the reason why I thought of that, I forget exactly what you said, so apologies, a moment ago, but it was about knowledge, about people not necessarily having the knowledge across different domains. Have you got anything to say about knowledge? So, for example, people retiring, people leaving.
Yeah.
Do you think that's knowledge management isn't talked about enough, and what do we do about it?
This really is a huge topic. So I think let's talk about the difference in data and information. Let's then talk about the difference in information and know-how or capabilities or competencies, and try and disentangle some of that. So if you think of data and information as the same, you tend to make the mistake that you gather everything. Now, I would define, for the purposes of today, information as being data that supports a decision or helps you do something. So it's got to have relevance, and it's got to stay relevant. So, for example, one of the projects I got involved with years ago was Terminal 5 at Heathrow. And the number of options to decide how to do a really integrated, complicated building with its services was done on the basis of the last possible moment. So they let everybody do designs and then say, does this work? No, this impacts me badly, or this would be better. And they then change things. The result is huge, huge amounts of data. Even done without paper, it's still huge amounts of data. Now, once you commission it, what use is that? Probably not at all. So it's the as-built data that becomes information that's useful, because that's what you can use through life or when changing it next time. So that in itself doesn't enable you to do things. People have competence, which is not quite the same thing as knowledge. So you could tell everybody, so well, take a person that you want to do a task, let's say in Terminal 5. You can give them all the drawings, you can tell them what the machines are, you can tell them what the result and the action is to be, and they might still be incompetent. So there's no point in putting a fishmonger in there if you actually need someone who needs knowledge of electronics and software. It doesn't mean that they don't have the capability. I'm not being rude about a fishmonger. You couldn't do it the other way around either. So what I'm saying is that the know-how is something that's really valuable. It's intangible, and a lot of managers don't think enough about this. Certainly governments don't. So, for example, in the UK, the nearest I get to politics is that the government thinks it can suddenly recruit a lot of doctors. Now, you can't get the fishmonger to be a brain surgeon tomorrow. I think most people would agree with that. So the whole underlying zone of education, the societal contribution. Then there's training, which might be domain specific or company or task specific. And unless you understand that and you build it, you haven't got that capability. But you know what? The other thing that a lot of managers don't think about is the culture. It's not about the prima ballerina. You've got all the other people in the chorus and on the stage at the same time for the spectacle to be important. So unless you get teams to work together, and this brings us back to silos and the working relationships and if you look at military arrangements, it's all about looking after your mates and doing things in a slick, practiced way. When you're tired and under threat, that's what lasts and works for you. So data is only useful as knowledge or information when it's relevant, and that means you need to throw it away through life and gather the new data. You need the know-how, which is built on education, but also training. But then you've got the experience and the culture and the behavioral, let's call it know-how as well. And that's the value that a lot of companies are really offering if they've stayed together and got teams.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? So thank you for that. I mean, certainly the culture aspect isn't one I was directly alluding to, and I think that is arguably the most important, or one facet that's equally as important as you've made that point, because it's about how the knowledge is applied or listened to or not, or is it revisited. For example, lessons learned, certainly in my sort of day job side of things, certainly lessons learned, and I will bring it back just to information for a moment, management. But some concepts are similar to asset management. I'll give you that, about managing information. Lessons haven't been learned, or that they at least haven't been recorded, and I think there's always missed opportunities. Have you got anything to say about lessons learned? I know it's just expanding, yes. But so, what would you like to say?
So I've made lots of mistakes in my life. And I've also listened to people tell me that you learn from your mistakes better than you learn from doing things well. No, you don't. You can learn an important lesson from your mistakes, but you also need to learn to do things well. And actually, that quotation is not quite full enough. You learn from reflecting on your mistakes. You don't learn from the mistakes. I think we can all look at people around us who make the same mistake time after time. They don't learn from it. What should we conclude from this? I think I'm cynical enough to believe that most projects don't actually do what they say they do. How many people genuinely go back and look at a big project properly, look at all the mistakes, drag them out, wash their dirty linen in front of their colleagues, and work out how not to do that again? Now, one of the problems is that a lot of big projects are consortia which are dissolved at the end of the project, which to my mind is incredibly wasteful. But it also applies if you think about smaller scale outsourcing and smaller companies. So the relationships there aren't formed overnight, and the working trust doesn't form overnight. And I think the mistakes can sometimes be just assumptions. Oh, I thought you were going to do that. Well, I didn't say I was. Yeah, but you always do that. And all those misunderstandings across often silo boundaries is what leads us into most mistakes. So companies think procedures will solve this. Well, they sort of do on paper, but ask yourself where they usually fall down, and it's usually across a silo wall.
David, you've there's lots of things to unpack as far as how you help resolve, but one thing which I will introduce to the audience just for the benefit of certainly of this podcast are things like BIM in the other context. So the International Standard ISO 19650 series, which of course we know it both well, but again for the benefit of the audience, which is best practice in managing information. Again, it can't solve all the problems of the world, but what it can do is help benchmark, can help show, expose, catch things early through reporting metrics, can't it? Maybe I'd be remiss if I don't mention also ISO 55000 series, David. I resisted mentioning it early on, but we're going to have to go there. Have you got anything to say? I know you've been involved in sort of the BIM and the information management side of it. Have you got anything to say about ISO 55000 and its relationship with the 19650 information side of things?
I'm an engineer. Standards are essential. I like standards, and they have their limitations. So the why question is worth asking before you do things that are expensive or are going to be expensive to get out of. In the early days of asset management, people would buy a system called an asset management system in various sales blurb, and they would believe they're doing asset management, but they weren't. And you need to change the behaviors. You need to understand what you want outcomes to be. You need to use these useful tools to do the things that you want to do. The same goes for BIM. The same goes for the information that we all need to manage. Ask yourself why, in often even small, but certainly in big companies, people keep their own spreadsheets. So they don't put some information into the system, or they keep their own copy of it because they can't get it out easily, and so on. And this is a classic double-edged sword, where you've got maybe a very capable system, but not set up for the user friendliness that it needs. So you then get multiple sources of information, and actually the people who've got their own information see that as the master copy, and you get into horrible configuration management system problems. So I think those standards and those management systems, the software and the systems in that sense as well, and the storage of data is absolutely essential. But you need to think about how they come together, and you need to understand and share outside the geeks how the system is designed and works. You need to share outside the designers how the maintainers have problems looking after it. You need to think about the marketeers who wanted something different anyway and think the customers aren't happy. So the integration comes back to the silo question, but the systems and the data and the standards need to be used carefully. Somebody once said to me, who was a bit of a cynic, the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. Now, the problem with that is he's right.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think talking about the management system, and again, of course, I'll link to the ones that we're talking about for the benefit of people that are new to these concepts. But that framework or management system or governance framework, whatever we want to call it, I know it's, that still takes it a level above, doesn't it? Often I'll say to people, well, ISO 9001, we don't want to necessarily list standards here, but a lot of people have heard of ISO 9001. I'm just mentioning that for the benefit of people that have. And they go, oh, yeah, I kind of get that. I go, well, think that level of magnitude or significance. And they go, okay, you know, it's not down in the weeds. We're talking big stuff here, overarching framework stuff, aren't we? Again, it's, I'm just paraphrasing here to the people that are new.
I think I'd like to make the point that there are multiple management systems and multiple management system standards. And the only way for me that a management exploits them properly is to integrate them. So the organization is what really has the management system or systems. You can look at systems of systems if you want to. And if you do all of those separately, you're actually doing it incredibly wastefully, and also you're not sharing the benefits, and also people begin to clash. So I think what I would suggest is that if you're interested in making an orderly organization, and especially as it gets bigger, it probably ought to be, and if it can survive changes of people and managers and experts, you need procedures and processes and management systems in general. But try to integrate them and think about the whole activity, think about all the silos. And I wouldn't worry so much about all the standards individually. I would look at trying to take what they advise you about, understand that, and then apply it, especially if it's interoperability with suppliers or customers, whatever else. Yes, you need to have data standards or whatever, but think about it and try and take them into your one organizational management system.
Great, thank you. Yeah, because it's having that higher level, isn't it? The like one, I always think of a triangle. No, I mean that's sort of implied from a lot of the things we've been talking about. But never mind Maslow's.
I'd add one last thing about that. Having said it, there are some people who believe that the management system does everything. I can show you that it doesn't, and you need to see it as a tool to be used. It does not manage, for example, your leaders. And there's a difference, and again, a whole podcast on the difference in leadership and management. Just because you're appointed to a senior position doesn't make you a leader, and you can be a leader without having the seniority at various levels. So the management system as written on paper tends, I find, to suit the Anglo-Saxon logical world, we call it the West. It doesn't always suit the Mediterranean or Latin temperament. And a lot of the cultures in some companies is, I'm the boss, I'll tell you what needs doing. And they don't see themselves as subject to the management system. And that needs understanding.
Great. Yes. Thank you, David. That comes back to the cultural aspect as well in a different dimension, doesn't it? In I know we meant organizational culture before, but it's a parallel. Just I thought my time, unbelievably, our time is almost gone, but I've got about 5 minutes. There was one point, I think we touched on the sort of points that we had. One thing specifically, and we may have touched on this, but was managing with imperfect information.
I think that's brilliant.
Now, just looping back to information, what would you like to say about that, David?
A man I admire from many years ago was Sir Peter Parker, who was the chairman of, at the time, British Rail was about 300,000 or more people. Just think about that, 300,000 people. We're talking about not only trains, but hotels, shipping, and such like. And he wasn't an engineer, he wasn't an economist, he was an artist primarily, I think, businessman and very talented. And he had 10 rules of management. And one of them was, and I'm paraphrasing now, but I can give it to you for the podcast. Look, check, but in the end you have to leap. So there is a danger, and we see this all the time with government or with difficulties in society. If you don't want to do something, we need to look into that further. Let's set up a report that we'll have in 6 months' time or 6 years' time. And the trouble is that often, leave aside the fact that the world changes and the facts may change, getting more and more and more data doesn't make it more evident that the decision is right. And there are some things you can't prove. So, for example, the tobacco industry for many years needed more research to prove that there was harm to people, whereas I think most people had concluded that. And that's maybe slightly arguable. There are many other examples which are similar. So there's a nice rule called Pareto, which is 20% and 80%, and it applies to so many things. And you can say that 20% of the effort gets you 80% of the way, and you get the law of diminishing return, the sort of the curve that tails off asymptotically. The same thing applies to information that you need for a decision. And one of my worries is that BIM and a number of those areas is assuming that you need more data than you actually do. And maybe, again, this is another whole discussion. I'm not accusing BIM of being out of line here. I think the people who see data-based or evidence-based decision-making, therefore more data is good, are missing the point. There's the data which is required to make the decision, and then there's more data which is a little bit peripheral, frankly. So I'm not sure if that was clear enough, but I hope it makes some sort of sense.
Yes, absolutely. And I think your point there about superfluous data, I completely agree with you. There could be too much. I wouldn't say BIM necessarily ISO 19650 series, again, this is for the benefit of people listening and watching, there is something called an exchange information requirement, which basically is you get what you ask for and what you need. So I think it's about getting it right, isn't it? It's about the client or the employer, whoever's paying, whoever's acquiring the information, or the recipient, knowing what they need and what they need it for. I think that does loop back into a lot of what we've talked about. It's like, what is the purpose? And I know I'm sort of trying to almost artificially pull in the standards here, but I don't think I am, because a lot of these decisions, or all of the decisions, require information, and it needs to be trustworthy, and it's a process.
Well, the asset management is often concerned with risk, and risk is another whole subtle area. And you could think about ISO 31000 or other people's ideas about how to judge it. The problem basically is that people have got used to these matrices where you do the potential impact and then the likelihood, and then you say, if it's both likely and horrendous, then it's really important, we'll color that red, and so on. And if it's not very likely and not important, then, well, it will try and put a guardrail up, but it's not important. The problem is the high impact event, which is not very likely. Now, what is it worth spending to prevent that or to deal with that? And there are horrible issues at the moment with things like earthquakes and whatever around the world. What can you try and prevent or provide for, and what can't you? So the decisions, if you go on getting more and more research and information, those decisions don't get better or easier.
It's a very good point you make about infrequent, for example, disaster risk modeling. Again, I'm certainly not an expert in it, but a little bit of experience in that, and I agree. It's having that conversation about how much information do you need, when do you take action, and when. Anyway, this is beyond the scope, but I think that point is well made. There are different risks, and they need to be understood with experts and with the experience. So our time is literally up, but thank you so much, David. I could go on all day about these topics, me, but thank you so much. So we'll have to sort of leave it there, but there would be some benefit if there were any other references or resources or events that you haven't mentioned. You've mentioned a few resources there, and obviously I'll link to them, but is there anything else that you recommend, particularly people new to the topic of strategic asset management? What resources do you recommend?
I would say look at the anatomy of asset management, but even before that, just settle down for 8 minutes. It's not a big ask, and watch the video, the big picture. That will give you an awful lot of insight. And actually, even recently, this video was done some years ago. I got a new set of people saying, this is fantastic. This applies to us, and it's timeless, really. If you're interested in that, and you might want to start off with only the first 30 pages, because that's the philosophy, the approach, the paradigm of thinking holistically, then read some more of the detail. And there's lots of further detail on that. If you're interested in where we're going, there's a recent publication on maturity and excellence. And that's at some of these higher levels that we've been talking about, the why, and what does it really mean to do some of this well.
Great, thank you, David. I will definitely link to them, and obviously the Institute of Asset Management itself, and the people can find the chapters for their area wherever they are. So thanks so much, David McKeown. I could speak all day, but thank you so much for your time and your insights and sharing the knowledge that you have today. So thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure, Stephen.